If you have to choose between protecting a child and protecting the law, choose the child. Laws can be rewritten. Childhood cannot. The words echoed through the Federation ethics chamber just seconds before every representative in the room voted to authorize the complete eradication of Earth's apex predators. No one applauded. No one argued. They simply believed they were making the galaxy a safer place. For months later, that vote would be remembered as the moment the Federation realized they had never truly understood humanity. Long before the hearings, before the diplomatic protests, before anyone whispered that Earth might actually be the most dangerous world ever cataloged, it was just another quiet Saturday morning outside Bozeman, Montana. Jack Sullivan leaned against the wooden railing of his back porch with a steaming mug of black coffee warming his hands while the cool mountain air drifted across the valley. His 10-year-old daughter, Emma, laughed as she chased something through the tall grass beyond the fence. "You better throw it farther this time," Jack called with a grin. "He knows all your tricks." Emma rolled her eyes. "Dad, Ranger lets me win." She launched a bright red rubber ball across the field. A massive gray wolf burst from the grass, sprinted after it with effortless speed, then returned a few moments later carrying the ball gently between his teeth before dropping it at Emma's feet with a satisfied wag of his thick tail. High above the ranch, hidden behind a layer of atmospheric camouflage, 3 Federation observation drones hovered silently. Inside the survey vessel, every scientist stared at the live feed without saying a word. Professor Narek adjusted his glasses and replayed the footage again. "Run the identification one more time." An officer hesitated. "Confirmed for the 5th time, Professor. Adult North American gray wolf. Apex predator designation. Fully capable of lethal hunting behavior." Another researcher slowly leaned toward the screen. "Then why is the juvenile touching its face?" No one answered. Emma wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck and buried her face against his thick fur. The wolf simply stood there, patient as an old family dog. Jack finally walked over carrying another tennis ball. Ranger looked up immediately, tail sweeping through the grass. "Ready, old man?" Jack asked. The wolf barked once and nudged Jack's hand with his nose. Professor Narek frowned. "Increase the zoom." The image sharpened. Old scars crossed Jack's hands. Fresh scratches covered Ranger's muzzle from wandering through the forest the night before. Neither appeared afraid of the other. They looked comfortable, like neighbors, like family. One of the younger biologists quietly broke the silence. "Every survival model predicts this relationship should end in tragedy." Narek nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the screen. "Perhaps the models are wrong." Then another notification flashed across the console. Thousands of similar relationships had been documented across Earth. Wolves, bears, falcons, working dogs, rescue animals, search teams, police units, ranches, homes, schools, retirement communities. The report continued for page after page. The cabin grew unusually quiet. Finally, one officer whispered the question none of them wanted to ask. If humans can peacefully live beside the planet's most dangerous predators, what exactly does that make humans? Professor Narek spent the next 72 hours trying to prove that the footage from Montana had been staged. He requested satellite archives, veterinary records, wildlife reports, environmental surveys, and family histories. Every file only made the mystery deeper. The Federation expected to find isolated incidents or carefully managed preserves. Instead, they found an entire civilization living beside creatures that every predictive model labeled as uncontrollable. The evidence stretched from Alaska to Florida, from quiet farming towns to crowded cities. Search and rescue dogs pulled hikers out of collapsed caves. Horses carried children with disabilities through therapy programs. Falcons worked with wildlife officers. Ranchers trusted enormous livestock guardian dogs to watch over newborn calves through freezing winter nights. Even police departments partnered with animals that could have easily injured an untrained handler. Yet the reports described trust, routine, and years of partnership. None of it fit Federation science. Back in Montana, life continued as though nobody in the sky was watching. Jack finished repairing a fence before walking toward the barn, where Emma was brushing Ranger's thick gray coat. Loose fur drifted through the afternoon sunlight like tiny snowflakes. "Easy there," Jack said with a smile. "You are making him look prettier than me." Emma giggled. "That is not hard, Dad. Jack laughed. Fair enough. Ranger leaned into the brush with a satisfied grunt, closing his eyes while Emma scratched behind one ear. At that exact moment, another observation drone recorded every movement. Inside the survey vessel, one young analyst shook his head. He is exposing his neck. Professor Narek looked up from his tablet. Who? The predator. Explain. Predatory species protect vulnerable areas during social contact. This one voluntarily lowered its guard. Another scientist quietly added, the human male is doing the same. Neither believes the other is a threat. Narek folded his arms. Then perhaps we are studying the wrong species. The room fell silent again. Later that afternoon, a Federation diplomatic shuttle landed several miles outside the Sullivan Ranch under the official banner of cultural exchange. Two representatives approached the front gate dressed in crisp silver uniforms. Jack stepped onto the porch and waved politely. Afternoon. Can I help you folks? The taller delegate forced a friendly smile. Mr. Sullivan, we are conducting a biological welfare survey. We noticed your companion. Jack glanced toward Ranger lying peacefully beneath the old oak tree. You mean my dog? The delegates exchanged confused looks. Our records identify that animal as Canis lupus. Jack chuckled. Technically, yes. Around here, he answers to Ranger. Emma walked onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She looked at the visitors. Would you like something to drink? Both delegates hesitated. They had rehearsed questions about predator containment, emergency procedures, and public safety. They had not prepared for homemade lemonade served by the child they believed should be terrified. One finally asked, Are you never afraid he might forget what he is? Jack looked toward Ranger, who lazily rolled onto his back while waiting for someone to rub his belly. Jack smiled before answering. No, because we never forget what we are, either. The delegates wrote down every word, believing they had just uncovered the key to understanding Earth's strange relationship with its predators. They had no idea they had actually documented the beginning of the Federation's greatest misunderstanding. The meeting that followed inside the Federation Biological Preservation Council lasted exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes. Not once did anyone ask a human to attend. Thousands of pages of research floated above the circular chamber while specialists debated charts, behavior models, ecological projections, and public safety forecasts. Professor Narek remained unusually quiet until the final recommendation appeared before him. Classification: Earth Apex Predator Network. Suggested action: Mandatory Planetary Removal Program. He looked up slowly. You are recommending extinction. A senior counselor calmly folded 4 hands together. We are recommending prevention. Humanity has simply become accustomed to an unacceptable level of biological risk. Another delegate added, no advanced civilization should normalize coexistence with apex predators. This practice cannot continue if Earth wishes to remain a full Federation member. Narek hesitated. Our field reports indicate these animals rarely attack under normal circumstances. That is precisely the problem, another scientist replied. They are unpredictable because humans have altered their natural instincts. We cannot allow an entire ecosystem of apex species to spread beyond Earth. The chamber approved the recommendation by an overwhelming majority. Within hours, the official directive reached every Federation embassy. On Earth, the announcement arrived just after breakfast. Jack was repairing an old tractor engine when his tablet chimed with an incoming government bulletin. Emma walked onto the porch holding a peanut butter sandwich, while Ranger followed close behind, hoping for a small piece of crust. Anything important? She asked. Jack read the headline once, then again, hoping he had misunderstood. His expression changed just enough for Emma to notice. Dad, he slowly lowered the tablet. Looks like Washington wants everyone to stay calm until they finish talking with the Federation. Emma frowned. Talking about what? Jack looked toward Ranger, who had stretched out in the warm afternoon sun without the slightest concern for politics or diplomacy. About him, Jack answered quietly. Emma blinked in confusion. Why would anyone want to talk about Ranger? Jack did not have an answer that made sense to a 10-year-old. By evening, every major news network carried the same story. Interviews filled the television. Wildlife experts, veterinarians, ranchers, search and rescue teams, military handlers, families, ordinary Americans all seemed equally confused. One retired firefighter looked directly into the camera and said, My rescue dog helped pull 12 people out of a collapsed building. If somebody thinks he is the problem, they have never met him. A young mother held her sleeping golden retriever close while telling reporters, "My son learned to walk by holding onto this dog's back. Tell me again which one is supposed to be dangerous." Across the country, similar conversations unfolded around dinner tables. Nobody sounded angry. They sounded bewildered. Even inside the Federation observation vessel, the analysts struggled to explain what they were seeing. Professor Narek watched another stream of interviews before quietly muting the audio. One of his assistants finally spoke. "Why are they not protesting?" Narek answered without looking away from the screen. "Because they still believe this is a misunderstanding." The assistant tilted his head. "And if it is not?" Narek slowly closed the report in front of him. "Then the Federation is about to discover that there are some relationships no law can measure and no decree can erase." The first thing people noticed was not the speeches. It was the silence. National parks quietly closed to visitors. Wildlife preserves stopped accepting reservations. Research stations canceled public tours without explanation. Across the country, familiar trails disappeared behind temporary gates that simply read, "Area closed for environmental management." Television anchors guessed it was a temporary response to the Federation directive, but nobody inside the government confirmed anything. Jack stood at the edge of his property, watching two dark green trucks roll slowly down the gravel road. They carried no military markings, only the seal of the United States Department of the Interior. 3 uniformed officers stepped out. The oldest offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Sullivan? That is me. My name is Daniel Brooks. We are asking for your cooperation." Jack looked from the officers to Ranger, who remained stretched beneath the oak tree with one lazy eye open. "Cooperation with what?" Brooks took a slow breath before answering. "There is no seizure order. Nobody is taking your animal. We simply need you to relocate him to a designated conservation zone for a while." Emma stepped onto the porch before Jack could answer. "Why?" "He lives here." Brooks knelt so he would not tower over her. Sometimes grown-ups have to solve problems before they become bigger problems. Emma looked directly into his eyes. "Ranger is not a problem." Brooks did not respond. He simply stood and quietly handed Jack a sealed envelope. "Read this after we leave." The trucks drove away without another word. Inside the envelope was a single page signed by the Secretary of the Interior. It contained no orders, no threats, and no deadlines. Only one sentence was highlighted: "Protect the bond. Everything else is secondary." Jack read it twice before folding the paper into his jacket pocket. Hundreds of miles away, similar conversations unfolded across America. Ranchers quietly loaded trusted working animals into trailers. Wildlife specialists relocated wolves from public viewing areas. Falconers canceled exhibitions. Search and rescue organizations temporarily reassigned their canine teams to undisclosed facilities. Every action looked routine. Every explanation sounded ordinary. Yet the pattern was impossible to ignore. High above Earth, Federation surveillance officers celebrated what they believed was overwhelming compliance. One analyst smiled as another map filled with disappearing tracking signals. "They are surrendering the predators voluntarily." Another replied, "Their own governments finally recognized the danger." Professor Narek remained unconvinced. He studied the same map in complete silence. Every tracking signal had vanished almost simultaneously, yet none of the environmental monitoring systems showed panic, abandoned habitats, or ecological disruption. The animals had not scattered. They had been moved with extraordinary coordination. "Run another comparison," he said quietly. "Compare civilian communications with government traffic." Minutes later, the results appeared. Public networks were calm. Emergency channels were almost completely silent. Transportation activity had increased, but not enough to match the number of relocated animals. Narek leaned back slowly. "This is not evacuation." One of the analysts frowned. "Then what are they doing?" Narek watched another image appear on the screen. Jack walking beside Ranger at sunset, neither in a hurry, neither looking afraid. "They are preparing," he answered softly. "The question is, preparing for what?" 3 days passed without a single public argument between Earth and the Federation. That silence began to worry people far more than angry headlines ever could. Jack noticed it first when his phone stopped ringing. Friends who usually called every weekend suddenly sent short messages instead. Neighbors waved from across the road, but rarely stayed to chat. Even the local diner felt different. The television above the counter still played the news, but everyone watched without saying much. Jack carried 2 boxes of supplies out to his truck before driving home. Emma was sitting on the front steps with Ranger resting beside her, one hand buried in his thick, gray fur. She looked up the moment she heard the engine. "Dad, are they still talking about us?" Jack forced a small smile. "They are talking about a lot of things, but mostly animals." He nodded once. "Mostly animals." Emma looked down at Ranger. "He does not know any of this is happening, does he?" Jack watched the old wolf lift his head after hearing Emma's voice, then gently place it against her shoulder. "No," he answered softly. "He only knows you are here." That evening, another government vehicle stopped outside the ranch. Daniel Brooks stepped out alone this time, carrying no folder, no clipboard, and no official expression. Jack invited him onto the porch. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Brooks finally accepted a cup of coffee and stared across the open field where Emma was tossing a tennis ball for Ranger beneath the fading orange sky. "My grandfather raised German shepherds," Brooks said quietly. "Best dogs I ever knew." Jack looked at him. "Then why are you here?" Brooks sighed. "Because people in offices keep asking questions about things they have never lived beside." Jack laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "That sounds about right." Brooks reached into his jacket and handed Jack another sealed envelope. "This one is not in order either." Jack opened it immediately. Inside was a transportation authorization with his family's name already printed across the top. Destination information had been blacked out. Attached was a handwritten note. "Bring everyone. Leave nothing behind." Jack stared at the page before folding it carefully. "How much time do we have?" Brooks looked toward the horizon instead of answering directly. "Not enough." Across the Atlantic, Professor Narek watched new satellite imagery arrive from Earth. Entire wildlife reserves appeared empty. Training facilities had gone dark. Rescue organizations had suspended demonstrations. Yet strangely, ecological balance reports remained perfectly stable. Predator populations had not collapsed. Food chains had not shifted. Forests remained healthy. Nothing matched the Federation's expectations. One young researcher pointed toward the screen. "Where did they all go?" Narek slowly zoomed in on dozens of tiny transportation routes spreading across North America like invisible threads. Every convoy avoided major highways. Every destination vanished beneath encrypted mapping protocols. He whispered almost to himself. They did not hide the animals. The analyst beside him frowned. Then what did they hide? Jack loading Emma's bicycle into the truck while Ranger calmly waited beside the open tailgate, as though this were another family camping trip. The professor felt a quiet uneasiness settle over him. Humans were not acting like people surrendering something dangerous. They were acting like families protecting someone they loved. And for the first time since arriving at Earth, Professor Narek wondered whether the Federation had mistaken compassion for recklessness and kindness for weakness. The convoy reached its destination just before sunrise. There were no fences topped with razor wire, no armed checkpoints, and no flashing warning signs. Instead, rolling pine forests stretched for miles beneath the pale morning sky. Small cabins sat beside open meadows, and narrow streams wound quietly through the valley. It looked less like a government facility and more like the kind of place families rented for summer vacations. Emma stepped out of the truck, taking a deep breath. "It smells like home," she whispered. Ranger trotted ahead, sniffing the grass before disappearing briefly into a patch of wildflowers. Jack watched him with a tired smile until a familiar voice called his name. "Mr. Sullivan." Daniel Brooks walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "Glad you made it." Jack accepted one. "This is the secret plan." Brooks looked around the valley. Part of it. As the morning unfolded, more families arrived. Some brought working dogs that had spent years beside firefighters. Others arrived with retired police horses, rescued wolves, trained falcons, and aging search and rescue companions. Nobody looked frightened. They greeted each other like neighbors meeting at a county fair. Children played catch while adults unloaded supplies. The animals wandered freely, occasionally stopping beside complete strangers who greeted them with gentle pats and familiar smiles. Hundreds of miles overhead, Federation reconnaissance drones transmitted everything in real time. Inside the observation vessel, analysts stared in disbelief. "Where are the containment barriers?" one asked. Another zoomed in on a group of children sitting beneath a large maple tree, while several wolves rested nearby. There are none. Professor Narek remained silent as more images appeared. Search dogs sleeping beside toddlers. Horses allowing children to braid their manes. Elderly veterans quietly sitting beside old companions without speaking a word. None of the behavior matched the Federation's predictive models. Increase audio capture, Narek instructed. A nearby conversation drifted through the speakers. An elderly woman smiled while scratching behind the ears of a large German shepherd. "You remember when you found Tommy after the blizzard?" she asked softly. The old dog slowly wagged his tail. Her grandson laughed. "Grandma, he cannot answer." She smiled without looking away. He already did. Another recording captured a teenage girl hugging a retired rescue dog before saying, "You saved my dad. You earned this retirement." The analysts exchanged uncertain glances. These were not owners speaking about dangerous animals. They were families speaking about lifelong friends. By late afternoon, Federation officials approved what they believed would finally settle the debate. A peaceful public demonstration would be held the following morning. Human representatives would be asked to present several apex predators under controlled observation so Federation scientists could document why coexistence posed such an unacceptable risk. The invitation reached Earth before sunset. Jack read the notice while sitting outside his cabin as Emma skipped stones across the creek, with Ranger watching every splash. Brooks approached quietly. Washington accepted. Jack looked up. "I figured they would." Brooks folded his arms. "They think tomorrow proves they are right." Jack smiled faintly before looking toward Emma. Ranger had retrieved one of the flat stones from the shallow water and proudly dropped it at her feet. She laughed so hard that the sound echoed through the valley. Jack shook his head with quiet affection. "No," he said. "Tomorrow they finally see what they have been refusing to understand." Far above the clouds, Professor Narek watched the same live feed in thoughtful silence. For days the Federation had searched for fear inside human society and found almost none. Instead, they kept finding trust. And somewhere deep inside, a question continued growing louder. What if humanity had never conquered Earth's apex predators at all? What if they had simply earned their trust over thousands of years, one family at a time? The demonstration began at exactly 9 o'clock under a clear blue Montana sky. Federation officials had expected reinforced cages, tranquilizer teams, emergency medical units, and layers of security surrounding every animal. Instead, they found folding chairs, picnic tables, and families sharing homemade muffins and fresh coffee while children laughed across an open meadow. Professor Narek stepped out of the shuttle first, his eyes scanning every corner of the valley. Nothing about the scene made sense. Daniel Brooks greeted the delegation with a polite handshake. "Welcome. We appreciate you making the trip." One council representative looked around in disbelief. "Where are your containment systems?" Brooks smiled politely. "You are standing in one." Confused murmurs spread through the delegation. A few moments later, Jack walked into the field with Emma beside him. Ranger stayed close, matching their pace without a leash. Behind them came other families with retired rescue dogs, working shepherds, falcons resting calmly on padded gloves, horses grazing nearby, and several rescued wolves moving comfortably among familiar faces. None showed signs of fear or aggression. They simply behaved as though this was another ordinary community gathering. One Federation biologist cautiously stepped closer while reading data from a handheld scanner. "Heart rate is stable," he whispered. "Stress hormones are nearly non-existent." Another scientist looked at Emma as she sat in the grass beside Ranger. "The juvenile is completely unafraid." Jack overheard him and smiled. "She has known him her whole life." The scientist frowned. "How did you train him to ignore instinct?" Jack shook his head. "That is the wrong question." The man looked puzzled. "Then what is the right question?" Jack glanced toward Ranger before answering. "Ask how we earn each other's trust." The words lingered in the quiet morning air. Professor Narek slowly walked toward a large display prepared by Earth researchers. It contained photographs stretching back thousands of years. Ancient cave paintings showed people hunting beside wolves. Early farming communities depended on dogs to guard livestock. Horses transformed transportation across continents. Falcons hunted alongside families long before modern technology existed. Search dogs located survivors after disasters. Service animals guided the blind. Therapy animals comforted children in hospitals. Every century revealed another chapter in the same story. Narek stopped in front of one faded photograph taken nearly 200 years earlier. A firefighter sat beside a soot-covered dog after a long rescue operation. Both looked exhausted. Both looked proud. A human historian standing nearby quietly said, "We never measured their value by how dangerous they were. We measured it by how often they stood beside us when life became difficult." The professor remained silent. For years, Federation science had assumed humanity dominated Earth's predators through superior intelligence or technology. Yet every piece of evidence pointed somewhere else entirely. Partnership, loyalty, shared hardship, mutual trust. None of those qualities fit neatly into an equation. One council member finally spoke in a low voice. "Our reports described humans as the masters of apex predators." Jack gently rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder. The old wolf leaned comfortably against his leg. "No," Jack replied. "Masters force obedience. Family earns loyalty." No one answered him. Across the meadow, children continued throwing tennis balls. Old dogs chased after them with joyful determination, and retired rescue animals rested peacefully beneath the trees. Professor Narek watched the scene for a long time before quietly closing his data tablet. At last he understood the mistake that had shaped every Federation conclusion. Humanity had never become Earth's dominant species because it could destroy the strongest creatures on the planet. Humanity became extraordinary because it discovered that trust could accomplish what fear never could. The return flight to the Federation capital was far quieter than the journey to Earth. Most delegates spent the trip reviewing recordings from the demonstration, hoping repeated analysis would reveal some hidden form of conditioning they had overlooked. They found nothing. Every scan confirmed the same impossible conclusion. Stress levels remained low. Behavioral responses remained voluntary. The animals responded to affection more often than commands. Professor Narek closed another report and looked out through the observation window. Somewhere below, Earth disappeared behind layers of cloud, carrying with it questions that Federation science could no longer answer. 3 days later, the High Council assembled for an emergency session. Representatives from dozens of member worlds filled the chamber, while enormous displays replayed scenes from Montana. Emma laughing as Ranger carried back a tennis ball. Elderly veterans sitting beside retired service dogs. Children reading books beneath trees while wolves rested peacefully nearby. The silence inside the chamber grew heavier after every clip. Finally, High Counselor Saravin broke it. "The demonstrations were emotionally compelling. They do not alter biological reality. Apex predators remain inherently dangerous." Another council member immediately nodded. "Affection cannot replace risk assessment." Professor Narek slowly stood. "No, but evidence can." Every eye turned toward him. He activated a series of charts above the chamber. Over the last 2 centuries, humans have recorded millions of interactions with these species. They have developed veterinary medicine, behavioral science, conservation programs, and rescue partnerships that have benefited both humans and wildlife. Their objective has never been domination. It has been coexistence. A representative from the Security Committee folded his arms. "Then why relocate the animals?" Narek answered without hesitation. "Because they believed we were about to separate families." The room became uncomfortably quiet. Before anyone could respond, another official hurried into the chamber, carrying an updated diplomatic briefing. The message came directly from Earth. There were no threats, no military alerts, no economic sanctions. Instead, every joint biological research program between Earth and the Federation had been suspended indefinitely. Veterinary exchanges were paused. Conservation partnerships ended. Wildlife genetics databases were disconnected from Federation networks. Educational programs were canceled. Centuries of cooperative scientific work disappeared with a handful of calm signatures. One delegate looked genuinely confused. "That is all." Another answered in disbelief. "Do you realize what we just lost?" The room quickly filled with overlapping conversations. Agricultural worlds relied on Terran veterinary research. Medical institutes studied immune systems developed through human-animal partnerships. Brooks looked toward Emma and Ranger. "Funny thing is, they still think this was about animals." Jack watched his daughter laugh as Ranger lazily rolled onto his side, asking for another belly rub. "It never was," he said quietly. It was about whether anyone has the right to decide what another family is allowed to love. Hundreds of light years away, that simple truth echoed through the Federation Council chamber, and for the first time, many of its leaders began to wonder whether the greatest mistake they had ever made was believing humanity needed lessons about compassion. Nearly 1 year later, the Federation quietly repealed the directive. There was no celebration, no dramatic announcement, and no public apology. The updated regulation appeared deep inside a routine legislative archive under a simple heading that few citizens would ever read. Earth native apex species. Classification revised. Cultural relationship protected. For most of the galaxy, it looked like nothing more than another bureaucratic correction. For the people who had lived through those uncertain months, it meant everything. Life slowly returned to normal across Earth. National parks reopened. Search and rescue teams returned to work. Mounted police rode familiar streets once again. Families visited wildlife centers, conservation parks, and hiking trails without cameras from another world studying every step. One cool autumn afternoon, Jack and Emma walked along a narrow forest path covered in golden leaves while Ranger wandered a few yards ahead, stopping every so often to look back, as if making sure they were still following. Emma smiled. "Do you think they finally understand?" Jack tucked his hands into his jacket pockets before answering. "Some of them probably do. What about the others?" He laughed softly. "Understanding people usually takes longer than understanding rules." Emma thought about that for a moment before reaching down to scratch Ranger behind one ear. "I still think they asked the wrong question." Jack raised an eyebrow. What question should they have asked? She looked at Ranger, then back at her father. "Not why we keep animals. They should have asked why animals keep trusting us." Jack smiled with quiet pride. "That is a much better question." Hundreds of light years away, Professor Narek stood before a class of young Federation cadets beginning their first year of diplomatic service. Instead of opening with military history or Federation law, he projected a single photograph across the lecture hall. It showed Emma sitting beneath the old oak tree with Ranger resting beside her, while Jack watched from the porch holding a coffee mug. Nothing extraordinary appeared in the picture. Just a family sharing an ordinary afternoon. One student raised a hand. "Professor, why is this image included in the diplomacy curriculum?" Narek looked around the room before answering. "Because every civilization eventually learns enough science to measure strength." He paused for a moment. "Very few learn how to recognize trust." The hall remained silent. "Our greatest mistake was believing power only existed where fear existed. Humanity taught us something different. They did not become remarkable because they lived beside dangerous creatures. They became remarkable because they built relationships strong enough that fear no longer ruled either side." Years later, that lesson would become required reading throughout the Federation Academy. Not as a chapter about Earth, not as a chapter about biology, as a chapter about wisdom. Back in Montana, the sun slipped behind the mountains as Emma tossed one last tennis ball across the field. Ranger, slower now with age but no less determined, trotted after it before proudly carrying it home again. Jack watched them together, taking in a moment so ordinary that it would never appear in a history book. Yet he suspected moments like this were the reason history mattered in the first place. Civilizations often remembered the wars they survived, the treaties they signed, and the technologies they invented. But the things that truly defined them were usually much quieter. A hand reaching for a paw. A child laughing without fear. A family choosing kindness when control would have been easier. In the end, the galaxy did not remember Earth because humans had tamed the world's apex predators. It remembered Earth because humanity had discovered something far rarer than dominance. It had learned that the strongest bond is never built by forcing another living being to obey. It is built when two different lives freely choose to walk home together.